Welcome to our 50th anniversary celebration of the Cuban Missile Crisis. 50 years ago this week, the world came about that close to turning itself into a cinder. And tonight we have President Kennedy and Comrade Khrushchev here to tell us about their experiences at that time. I'll turn it over to them.
Mr. Vice President, I'd like to pin down the difference between the way you would handle Castro's regime and prevent the establishment of communist governments in the Western Hemisphere and the way that Senator Kennedy would proceed. Vice President Nixon, in what important respects do you feel there are differences between you, and why do you believe your policy is better for the peace and security of the United States in the Western Hemisphere?
Our policies are very different. I think that Senator Kennedy's policies and recommendations for the handling of the Castro regime are probably the most dangerously irresponsible recommendations that he's made during the course of this campaign. In effect, what Senator Kennedy recommends is that the United States government should give help to the exiles and to those within Cuba who oppose the Castro regime, provided they are anti-Batista. Now let's just see what this means. We have 5 treaties with Latin America, including the one setting up the Organization of American States in Bogota in 1948, in which we've agreed not to intervene in the internal affairs of any other American country, and they as well have agreed to do likewise. The Charter of the United Nations, its preamble, Article 1 and Article 2, also provide that there shall be no intervention by one nation in the internal affairs of another. Now, I don't know what Senator Kennedy suggests when he says that we should help those who oppose the Castro regime, both in Cuba and without. But I do know this, that if we were to follow that recommendation, that we would lose all of our friends in Latin America, we would probably be condemned in the United Nations, and we would not accomplish our objective. I know something else. It would be an open invitation for Mr. Khrushchev to come into Latin America and to engage us in what would be a civil war and possibly even worse than that. This is the major recommendation that he's made. Now, what can we do? Well, we can do what we did with Guatemala. There was a communist dictator that we inherited from the previous administration. We quarantined Mr. Arbenz. The result was that the Guatemalan people themselves eventually rose up and they threw him out. We are quarantining Mr. Castro today. We are quarantining him diplomatically by bringing back our ambassador, economically by cutting off trade, and Senator Kennedy's suggestion that the trade that we cut off is not significant is just 100% wrong. We are cutting off the significant items that the Cuban regime needs in order to survive. By cutting off trade, by cutting off our diplomatic relations as we have, we will quarantine this regime so that the people of Cuba themselves will take care of Mr. Castro. But for us to do what Senator Kennedy has suggested would bring results which I know he would not want, and certainly which the American people would not want.
Mr. Nixon shows himself misinformed. He surely must be aware that most of the equipment and arms and resources for Castro came from the United States, flowed out of Florida and other parts of the United States to Castro in the mountains. There isn't any doubt about that, number one. Number two, I believe that if any economic sanctions against Latin America are going to be successful, they have to be multilateral. They have to include the other countries of Latin America. The very minute effect of the action which has been taken this week on Cuba's economy, I believe Castro can replace those markets very easily through Latin America, through Europe, and through Eastern Europe. If the United States had stronger prestige and influence in Latin America, it could persuade, as Franklin Roosevelt did in 1940, the countries of Latin America to join in an economic quarantine of Castro. That's the only way you can bring real economic pressure on the Castro regime, and also the countries of Western Europe, Canada, Japan, and the others. Number three, Castro is only the beginning of our difficulty throughout Latin America. The big struggle will be to prevent the influence of Castro spreading to other countries. Mexico, Panama, Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia. We're going to have to try to provide closer ties, to associate ourselves with the great desire of these people for a better life, if we're going to prevent Castro's influence from spreading throughout all of Latin America. His influence is strong enough today to prevent us from getting the other countries of Latin America to join with us in economic quarantine. His influence is growing, mostly because this administration has ignored Latin America. You yourself said, Mr. Vice President, a month ago, that if we had provided the kind of economic aid 5 years ago that we are now providing, we might never have had Castro. Why didn't we?
John?
Good evening. Thank you for coming. First of all, I want to say I know this is the other foreign policy debate this evening, so I appreciate having a great audience tonight. I'm going to be reading a radio and television report to the American people on Soviet arms buildup, and this is dated October 22nd, 1962, and this is from the words of President John F. Kennedy. Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature last Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., I directed that our surveillance be stepped up. And having now confirmed and completed our evaluation of the evidence and our decision on a course of action, this government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail. The characteristics of these new missile sites indicate two distinct types of installations. Several of them include medium-range ballistic missiles, capable of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles. Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States, in Central America, or in the Caribbean area. This urgent transformation of Cuba into an important strategic base by the presence of these large, long-range, and clearly offensive weapons of sudden mass destruction constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas. This action also contradicts the repeated assurances of Soviet spokesmen, both publicly and privately delivered, that the arms buildup in Cuba would retain its original defensive character, and that the Soviet Union had no need or desire to station strategic missiles on the territory of any other nation. The size of this undertaking makes clear that it has been planned for some months. Yet only last month, after I had made clear the distinction between any introduction of ground-to-ground missiles and the existence of defensive anti-aircraft missiles, the Soviet government publicly stated on September 11 that, and I quote, "The armaments and military equipment sent to Cuba are designed exclusively for defensive purposes," unquote. That, and I quote the Soviet government, "There is no need for the Soviet government to shift its weapons for a retaliatory blow to any other country, for instance, Cuba," unquote. And that, and I quote their government, "The Soviet Union has so powerful rockets to carry these nuclear warheads that there is no need to search for sites for them beyond the boundaries of the Soviet Union," unquote. That statement was false. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear, once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, "pursued solely for the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba," unquote. That, and I quote him again, "training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive, and if it were otherwise," Mr. Gromyko went on, "the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance." That statement was also false. Neither the United States of America nor the world community of nations can tolerate deliberate deception and offensive threats on the part of any nation, large or small. We no longer live in a world where only the actual firing of weapons represents an efficient challenge to the nation's security to constitute maximum peril. Nuclear weapons are so destructive and ballistic missiles are so swift that any substantially increased possibility of their use or any sudden change in their deployment may well be regarded as a definite threat to peace. For many years, both the Soviet Union and the United States, recognizing this fact, have deployed strategic nuclear weapons with great care, never upsetting the precarious status quo, which ensured that these weapons would not be used in the absence of some vital challenge. Our own strategic missiles have never been transferred to the territory of any other nation under a cloak of secrecy and deception. And our history, unlike that of the Soviets since the end of World War II, demonstrates that we have no desire to dominate or conquer any other nation or impose our system upon its people. Nevertheless, American citizens have become adjusted to living daily on the bullseye of Soviet missiles located inside the USSR or in submarines. In that sense, missiles in Cuba add to an already clear and present danger, although it should be noted that the nations of Latin America have never previously been subjected to a potential nuclear threat. By this secret, swift, and extraordinary buildup of communist missiles in an area well known to have a special and historical relationship to the United States and the nations of the Western Hemisphere, in violation of Soviet assurances and in defiance of American and hemispheric policy, this sudden, clandestine decision to station strategic weapons for the first time outside of Soviet soil is a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo which cannot be accepted by this country. If our courage and our commitments are ever to be trusted again by either friend or foe. Our policy has been one of patience and restraint, as befits a peaceful and powerful nation, which leads a worldwide alliance. We have been determined not to be diverted from our central concerns by mere irritants and fanatics. By now, further action is required, and it is underway, and these actions may be only the beginning. We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the costs of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced. Acting, therefore, in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution as endorsed by the resolution of Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. First, to halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba from whatever nation or port will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. This quarantine will be extended, if needed, to other types of cargo and carriers. We are not, at this time, however, denying the necessities of life as the Soviets attempted to do in their Berlin blockade of 1948. Second, I've directed the continued and increased close surveillance of Cuba and its military buildup. The foreign ministers of the Organization of American States, in their communique of October 6th, rejected secrecy on such matters in this hemisphere. Further, should these offensive military preparations continue, thus increasing the threat to this hemisphere, further action will be justified. I have directed the armed forces to prepare for all eventualities, and I trust that in the interest of both the Cuban people and the Soviet technicians at the sites, the hazards to all concerned of continuing this threat will be recognized. Third, it shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. Fourth, as a necessary military precaution, I have reinforced our base at Guantanamo, evacuated today the dependents of all our personnel there, and ordered additional military units to be on standby alert basis. Fifth, we are calling tonight for an immediate meeting of the organ of consultation under the Organization of American States to consider this threat to hemispheric security and to invoke Articles 6 and 8 of the Rio Treaty in support of all necessary action. The United Nations Charter allows for regional security arrangements, and the nations of this hemisphere decided long ago against the military presence of outside powers. Our other allies around the world have also been alerted. Sixth, under the Charter of the United Nations, we are asking tonight that an emergency meeting of the Security Council be convoked without delay to take action against this latest Soviet threat to world peace. Our resolution will call for the prompt dismantling and withdrawal of all offensive weapons in Cuba under the supervision of UN observers before the quarantine can be lifted. Seventh and finally, I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in a historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. He has an opportunity now to move the world back from the abyss of destruction by returning to his government's own words that it had no need to station missiles outside its own territory, and withdrawing these weapons from Cuba by refraining from any action which would widen or deepen the present crisis, and then by participating in a search for peaceful and permanent solutions. This nation is prepared to present its case against the Soviet threat to peace and our own proposals for a peaceful world at any time and in any forum, in the Organization of American States, in the United Nations, or in any other meeting that could be useful without limiting our freedom of action. We have in the past made strenuous efforts to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. We have proposed the elimination of all arms and military bases in a fair and effective disarmament treaty. We are prepared to discuss new proposals for the removal of tensions on both sides, including the possibilities of a genuinely independent Cuba, free to determine its own destiny. We have no wish to war with the Soviet Union, for we are a peaceful people who desire to live in peace with all other peoples. But it is difficult to settle or even discuss these problems in an atmosphere of intimidation. That is why this latest Soviet threat, or any other threat which is made either independently or in response to our actions this week, must and will be met with determination. Any hostile move anywhere in the world against the safety and freedom of peoples to whom we are committed, including in particular the brave people of West Berlin, will be met by whatever action is needed. My fellow citizens, let no one doubt that this is a difficult and dangerous effort on which we have set out. No one can foresee precisely what course it will take or what costs or casualties will be incurred. Many months of sacrifice and self-discipline lie ahead, months in which both our patience and our strength will be tested, months in which many threats and denunciations will keep us aware of our dangers. But the greatest danger of all would be to do nothing. The path we have chosen for the present is full of hazards, as all paths are. But it is the one most consistent with our character and courage as a nation and our commitments around the world. The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is a path of surrender or submission. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved. Thank you and good night.
Dear Mr. President, just imagine, Mr. President, that we had presented to you with the conditions of an ultimatum which you have presented us by your action. How would you have reacted to this? I think you would have been indignant at such a step on our part, and this would have been understandable to us. In presenting us with these conditions, you, Mr. President, have flung a challenge at us. Who asked you to do this? By what right did you do this? Our ties with the Republic of Cuba, like our relations with other states, regardless of what kinds of states they are or may be, concern only the two countries between which these relations exist. And if we now speak of the quarantine to which your letter refers, a quarantine may be established according to accepted international practice only by agreement of states between themselves and not by some third party. Quarantines exist, for example, on agricultural goods and products. But in this case, the question is in no way one of quarantine, but rather of far more serious things, and you yourself understand this. You, Mr. President, are not declaring a quarantine, but rather are setting forth an ultimatum and threatening that if we do not give in to your demands, that you will use force. Consider what you are saying. And you want to persuade me to agree to this? What would it mean to agree to these demands? It would mean guiding oneself in one's relations with other countries, not by reason, but by submitting to arbitrariness. You are no longer appealing to reason, but wish to intimidate us. No, Mr. President, I cannot agree to this. And I think that it is in your heart you recognize that I am correct. I am convinced that in my place you would act the very same way. Reference to the decision of the Organization of American States cannot in any way substantiate the demands now advanced by the United States. This organization has absolutely no authority or basis for adopting decisions such as the one you speak of in your letter. Therefore, we do not recognize these decisions. International law exists and universally recognized norms of conduct exist. We firmly adhere to principles of international law and observe strictly the norms which regulate navigation on the high seas. In international waters, we observe these norms and enjoy the rights recognized by all states. You wish to compel us to renounce the rights that every sovereign state enjoys. You are trying to legislate in questions of international law, and you are violating the universally accepted norms of that law. And you are doing all this not only out of hatred for the Cuban people and its government, but also because of considerations of the election campaign in the United States. What morality, what law can justify such an approach by the American government to international affairs? No such morality or law can be found because the actions of the United States with regard to Cuba constitute outright banditry. Or, if you like, the folly of degenerate imperialism. Unfortunately, such folly can bring grave sufferings to the people of all countries, and to no lesser degree to the American people themselves, since the United States has completely lost its former isolation with the advent of modern types of armaments. Therefore, Mr. President, if you coolly weigh the situation which has developed, not giving way to your passions, you will understand that the Soviet Union cannot fail to reject the arbitrary demands of the United States. When you confront us with such conditions, try to put yourself in our place and consider how the United States would react to these conditions. I do not doubt that if someone attempted to dictate similar conditions to you, the United States, you would reject such an attempt. And we also say no.
John F. Kennedy to Nikita Khrushchev, October 25th, 1962, 1:59 a.m. Dear Mr. Chairman, I have received your letter of October 24th, and I regret very much that you still do not appear to understand what it is that has moved us in this matter. The sequence of events is clear. In August, there were reports of important shipments of military equipment and technicians from the Soviet Union to Cuba. In early September, I indicated very plainly that the United States would regard any shipment of offensive weapons as presenting the gravest issues. After that time, this government received the most explicit assurances from your government and its representatives, both publicly and privately, that no offensive weapons were being sent to Cuba. If you will review the statement issued by TASS in September, you will see how clearly this assurance was given. In reliance on these solemn assurances, I urged restraint upon those in this country who were urging action in this matter at that time. And then I learned beyond doubt what you have not denied, namely that all these public assurances were false and that your military people had set out recently to establish a set of missile bases in Cuba. I ask you to recognize clearly, Mr. Chairman, that it was not I who issued the first challenge in this case, and that in the light of this record, these activities in Cuba require the responses I have announced. I repeat my regret that these events should cause a deterioration in our relations. I hope that your government will take the necessary action to permit a restoration of the earlier situation. Sincerely yours, John F. Kennedy.
Dear Mr. President, I have received your letter of October 25th. From your letter, I got the feeling that you have some understanding of the situation, which has developed, and some sense of responsibility. I value this. I think you will understand me correctly that if you are really concerned about the welfare of the world, everybody needs peace. Both capitalists, if they have not lost their reason, and still more communists, people who know how to value not only their own lives, but more than anything, the lives of the people. We communists are against all wars between states in general and have been defending the cause of peace since we came into the world. We have always regarded war as a calamity, not as a game nor as a means for the attainment of definite goals, nor all the more as a goal itself. Our goals are clear, and the means to attain them is labor. War is our enemy and a calamity for all peoples. It is thus that we, the Soviet people, and together with the U.S., other peoples as well, understand the questions of war and peace. I can, in any case, firmly say this for the peoples of the socialist countries as well, for all the progressive peoples who want peace, happiness, friendship amongst peoples. I see, Mr. President, that you too are not devoid of any sense of anxiety for the fate of the world. What would a war give you? You are threatening us with war. But you well know that the very least which you could receive in reply would be that you would experience the same consequences as those you sent us. And that must be clear to us, people invested with authority, trust, and responsibility. We must not succumb to the intoxication and petty passions, regardless of whether elections are impending in that country or not impending. These are all transient things. But if indeed war should break out, then it would not be in our power to stop it, for such is the logic of war. I have participated in 2 wars and know that war ends when it has rolled through cities and villages, everywhere sowing the seeds of death and destruction. In the name of the Soviet government and the Soviet people, I assure you that your conclusions regarding offensive weapons on Cuba are groundless. It is apparent from what you have written me that our conceptions are different on this score, or rather, we have different estimates of these or those military means. Indeed, in reality, the same forms of weapons can have different interpretations. You are a military man, and I hope will understand me. Let us take, for example, a simple cannon. What sort of means is this? Offensive or defensive? A cannon is a defensive means if it is set up to defend boundaries or a fortified area. But if one concentrates artillery and adds to it the necessary number of troops, then the same cannons do become an offensive means because they prepare and clear the way for the infantry attack. The same happens with nuclear weapons as well, with any type of this weapon. You are mistaken if you think that any of our means on Cuba are offensive. However, let us not quarrel now. It is apparent that I will not be able to convince you of this, but I say to you, Mr. President, are a military man and should understand. Can one attack if one has on one's territory even an enormous quantity of missiles of various effective radiuses and various power, but using only these means? These missiles are a means of extermination and destruction. But one cannot attack with these missiles, even nuclear missiles of a power of 100 megatons, because only people, troops, can attack. Without people, any means, however powerful, cannot be offensive. How can one consequently give such a completely incorrect interpretation as you are now giving to the effect that some sort of means on Cuba are offensive? All of the means located there, and I assure you of this, have a defensive character, are on Cuba solely for the purposes of defense, and we have sent them to Cuba at the request of the Cuban government. You, however, say that these are offensive means. But, Mr. President, do you really seriously think that Cuba can attack the United States, and that even we together with Cuba can attack you from the territory of Cuba? Can you really think that way? How is that possible? We do not understand this. Has something so new appeared in the military strategy that one can think that it is possible to attack thus? I say precisely attack and not destroy, since barbarians, people who have lost their sense, destroy. You have now proclaimed piratical measures, which were employed in the Middle Ages when ships proceeding in international waters were attacked. And you have called this a quarantine around Cuba. Our vessels apparently will soon enter the zone which your Navy is patrolling. I assure you that these vessels, now bound for Cuba, are carrying the most innocent, peaceful cargoes. Do you really think that we only occupy ourselves with the carriage of so-called offensive weapons, atomic and hydrogen bombs? Although perhaps your military people imagine that these cargoes are some sort of special type of weapon. I assure you, they are the most ordinary of peaceful products. Consequently, Mr. President, let us show good sense. I assure you that on those ships, which are bound for Cuba, there are no weapons at all. The weapons which were necessary for the defense of Cuba are already there. I do not want to say that there were not any shipments of weapons at all. No, there were such shipments. But now Cuba has already received the necessary means of defense. I don't know whether you can understand and believe me. I should like to have you believe in yourself and to agree that one cannot give way to passions. It is necessary to control them. And in what direction are we now developing? If you stop the vessels, then as you know yourself, that would be piracy. If we started to do that with regard to your ships, then you would also be as indignant as we and the whole world are now. One cannot give another interpretation to such actions because one cannot legalize lawlessness. If this were permitted, then there would be no peace. There would also be no peaceful coexistence. we should then be forced to put into effect the necessary means of a defensive character to protect our interests in accordance with international law. Why should this be done? To what would all this lead? If assurances were given by the President and the government of the United States that the United States itself would not participate in an attack on Cuba and would restrain others from actions of this sort, if you would recall your fleet, if this would immediately change everything. I am not speaking for Fidel Castro, but I think that he and the government of Cuba evidently would declare demobilization and would appeal to the people to get down to peaceful labor. Then, too, the question of armaments would disappear, since if there is no threat, then armaments are a burden for every people. Then, too, the question of the destruction, not only of the armaments which you call offensive, but of all the other armaments as well, would look different. Armaments only bring disaster. When one accumulates them, this damages the economy, and if one puts them to use, then they destroy people on both sides. Consequently, only a madman can believe that armaments are the principal means in life of society. No, they are an enforced loss of human energy. And what is more, are for the destruction of man himself. If people do not show wisdom, then in the final analysis they will come to a clash like blind moles, and then reciprocal extermination will begin. Let us therefore show statesmanlike wisdom. I propose we, for our part, will declare that our ships bound for Cuba will not carry any kind of armaments. You would declare that the United States will not invade Cuba with its forces and will not support any sort of forces which might intend to carry out an invasion of Cuba. Then the necessity for the presence of our military specialists in Cuba would just disappear. Mr. President, I appeal to you. I appeal to you to weigh well what the aggressive, piratical actions which you have declared the USA intends to carry out in international waters, what it would lead to. You yourself know that any sensible man cannot simply agree with this, cannot recognize your right to such actions. If you did this as the first step toward unleashing of war, well then it is evident nothing else is left for us to accept this challenge of yours. If, however, you have not lost your sense of self-control and sensibly conceive what this might lead to, Mr. President, we and you ought not to pull on the ends of the rope in which you have tied the knot of war. Because the more the two of us pull, the tighter that knot will be tied. And a moment may come when that knot will be tied so tight that even he who tied it will not have the strength to untie it. And then it will be necessary to cut that knot. And what that would mean is not for me to explain to you, because you yourself understand perfectly of what terrible forces our countries dispose. Consequently, if there is no intention to tighten that knot and thereby to doom the world to catastrophe of thermonuclear war, then let us not only relax these forces pulling on the ends of the rope, let us take measures to untie that knot.
We now know that the Soviet Union, not content with Dr. Castro's oath of fealty. Not content with the destruction of Cuban independence, not content with the extension of Soviet power into the Western Hemisphere, not content with a challenge to the inter-American system and to the United Nations Charter, has decided to transform Cuba into a base for communist aggression, into a base for putting all of the Americas under the nuclear gun, and thereby to intensify the Soviet diplomacy of blackmail in every part of the world.
The United States answer to what Adlai Stevenson termed Soviet blackmail in Cuba was a quarantine of all offensive weapons being shipped from Russia to that island fortress. The U.S. threw up a steel fence prepared to stop any vessel carrying materials of war. In Cuba itself, 100,000 men were put under emergency orders as they had been during past invasion scares. The waterfront in Havana and along other parts of the coast bristled with gun emplacements as the Cuban regime waited to see what their bosses in the Kremlin were to do. Cuba became the focus of world attention. Here centered the most critical threat of global war since the surrender of Germany 17 years ago. Castro has put every able-bodied man through military training. He has even armed some as young as 12 years of age, and authorities assembled thousands in cities and villages for patriotic rallies. As in the past, these rallies are designed to whip up hate of what Castro calls Yankee imperialistic warmongers. To suggestions that a UN team inspect missile sites, Castro said that they had better come ready for combat. He went on to call President Kennedy a pirate for setting up the quarantine. The United States arrived at the decision for an arms blockade after studying reconnaissance photographs made with high-powered cameras from planes flying several miles from the Cuban coast. These cameras are described as capable of spotting a golf ball on a putting green from 40,000 feet. Literally thousands of pictures can be made on each flight by these planes, and they are studied by photo interpreters who are capable of analyzing details that an untrained eye would miss. Here, for example, is a medium-range ballistic missile base that has been labeled by these specialists. Suddenly, the veil is torn from the Russian secrets. Another photo revealed a surface-to-air missile assembly depot, a base to supply the offensive sites. Russian technicians ripped through heavy jungle growth to carve out airstrips for high-performance MiG-21 jets, a plane easily capable of strikes far into the United States. In the greatest display of hemisphere solidarity since World War II, the Organization of American States unanimously endorses the actions of the United States, and many pledge arms and men to the cause. The vote is 20-0, with Cuba absent, commending the U.S. for its efforts to bring about the dismantling of the missile bases. The organization votes the use of armed force to carry out the resolution sponsored by Secretary of State Dean Rusk, thus uniting all of the Americas in a common cause. Meanwhile, the United States continues to reinforce its Cuban base at Guantanamo Bay, the naval depot that Castro wants the U.S. to give up. These Marines have been assigned the job of protecting the base against any Cuban threats that might arise during the present crisis. They'll be on a 24-hour alert, a first line of defense. The United States went to the UN Security Council for a resolution calling for a withdrawal of all offensive weapons from Cuba. A delegation from the island heard UTAD call on both sides for a 3-week freeze, but the Secretary General was told that President Kennedy wants the missiles scrapped first. Pellegrin and Dr.'s boss, Khrushchev, proposed that the U.S. withdraw its vessels and he would stop shipments. President Kennedy's missile scrapping demand was his reply. The U.S. resolution was firm and strongly worded.
Mr. President, I am submitting today a resolution to the Security Council designed to find a way out of this calamitous situation. This resolution calls, as an interim measure under Article 40 of the Charter, for the immediate dismantling and withdrawal from Cuba of all missile and other offensive weapons. It further authorizes and requests the Acting Secretary General to dispatch to Cuba a United Nations Observer Corps to assure and report on compliance with this resolution. Upon UN certification of compliance, it calls for the termination of the measures of quarantine against military shipments to Cuba. And in conclusion, it urgently recommends that the United States and the Soviet Union confer promptly on measures to remove the existing threat to the security of the Western Hemisphere and the peace of the world, and to report thereon to the Security Council.
On October 27th, the White House received a second letter from Khrushchev. You will notice a very different tone in this letter as compared to the one I read previous. Dear Mr. President, in your statement, you expressed the opinion that the main aim was not simply to come to an agreement and take measures to prevent contact between our vessels and consequently a deepening crisis which could, as a result of such contacts, spark a military conflict, after which all negotiations would be superfluous because of the forces and other laws would then come into play, the laws of war. I agree with you that this is only the first step. The main thing that must be done is to normalize and stabilize the state of peace among states, among peoples. I understand your concern for the security of the United States, Mr. President, because this is the primary duty of a president. But we too are disturbed about these same questions. I bear these same obligations as chairman of the Council of Ministers of the USSR. You have been alarmed by the fact that we have aided Cuba with weapons in order to strengthen its defense capability. Precisely defense capability. Because whatever weapons it may possess, Cuba cannot be equated with you since the difference in magnitude is so great, particularly in view of modern means of destruction. Our aim has been and is to help Cuba, and no one can dispute the humanity of our motives, which are oriented toward enabling Cuba to live peacefully and develop in the way its people desire. You wish to ensure the security of your country, and this is understandable, but Cuba too wants the same thing. All countries want to maintain their security, but how are we, the Soviet Union, our government, to assess your actions which are expressed in the fact that you have surrounded the Soviet Union with military bases, surrounded our allies with military bases, placed military bases literally around our country, and stationed your missile armaments there? This is no secret. Responsible American personages openly declare that it is so. Your missiles are located in Britain, they are located in Italy, and are aimed against us. Your missiles are located in Turkey. You are disturbed over Cuba. You say this disturbs you because it is 90 miles by sea from the coast of the United States of America. But Turkey adjoins us. Our sentries patrol back and forth and see each other. Do you consider then that you have the right to demand security for your own country and the removal of the weapons you call offensive, but do not accord the same right to us? You have placed destructive missile weapons, which you call offensive, in Turkey, literally next to us. How then can recognition of our equal military capacities be reconciled with such unequal relations between our great states? This is irreconcilable. It is good, Mr. President, that you have agreed to have our representatives meet and begin talks, apparently through the mediation of Buildup, Acting Secretary General of the United Nations. Consequently, he too to some degree has assumed the role of mediator, and we consider that he will be able to cope with this responsible mission provided, of course, that each party drawn into this controversy displays goodwill. I think it would be possible to end the controversy quickly and normalize the situation, and then the people could breathe more easily, considering that statesmen charged with responsibility are of sober mind and have an awareness of their responsibility combined with the ability to solve complex questions and not bring things to a military catastrophe. I therefore make this proposal. We are willing to remove from Cuba the means which you regard as offensive. We are willing to carry this out and to make this pledge in the United Nations. Your representatives will make a declaration to the effect that the United States, for its part, considering the uneasiness and anxiety of the Soviet state, will remove its analogous means from Turkey. Let us reach agreement as to the period of time needed by you and by us to bring this about. And after that, persons entrusted by the United Nations Security Council could inspect on the spot the fulfillment of the pledges made. Of course, the permission of the governments of Cuba and Turkey is necessary for entry into those countries of these representatives and for the inspection of the fulfillment of the pledge made by each side. Of course, it would be best if these representatives enjoyed the confidence of the Security Council as well as yours and mine, both the United States and the Soviet Union, and also that of Turkey and Cuba. I do not think it would be difficult to select people who would enjoy the trust and respect of all the parties concerned. We, in making this pledge, in order to give satisfaction and hope to the peoples of Cuba and Turkey, and to strengthen their confidences in their security, will make a statement within the framework of the Security Council, to the effect that the Soviet government gives a solemn promise to respect the inviolability of the borders and sovereignty of Turkey, and not to interfere in its internal affairs, not to invade Turkey, and not to make available our territory as a bridgehead for such invasion. And that it would also restrain those who contemplate committing aggression against Turkey, either from the territory of the Soviet Union or from the territory of Turkey's other neighboring states. The United States government will make a similar statement within the framework of the Security Council regarding Cuba. It will declare that the United States will respect the inviolability of Cuba's borders and its sovereignty, will not pledge to interfere in its internal affairs, not to invade Cuba itself or make its territory available as a bridgehead for such an invasion, and will also restrain those who might contemplate committing aggression against Cuba, either from the territory of the United States or from the territory of Cuba's other neighboring states. Of course, for this we would have to come to an agreement with you, and certainly and specifically a certain time limit. Let us agree to some period of time, but without unnecessary delay, say within 2 or 3 weeks, not longer than a month. The means situated in Cuba of which you speak and disturb you, as you have stated, are in the hands of Soviet officers. Therefore, any accidental use of them to the detriment of the United States is excluded. These means are situated in Cuba at the request of the Cuban government and are there for defensive purposes. Therefore, if there is no invasion of Cuba or an attack on the Soviet Union or any other of our allies, then of course these means are not and will not be a threat to anyone, for they are not for the purposes of attack. If you are agreeable to my proposal, Mr. President, then we would send our representatives to New York, to the United Nations, and would give them comprehensive instructions in order that any agreement may be reached more quickly. If you also select your people and give them the corresponding instructions, then this question can be very quickly resolved. Why would I like to do this? Because the whole world is now apprehensive and expects sensible actions of us. The greatest joy for all peoples would be the announcement of our agreement and of the eradication of this controversy that has arisen. I attach great importance to this agreement insofar as it could serve as a good beginning and could, in particular, make it easier to reach agreement on banning nuclear weapons tests. The question of the tests could be solved in parallel fashion without connecting one with the other, because these are different issues. However, it is important that agreement be reached on both these issues so as to present humanity with a fine gift, and also to gladden it with the news that agreement has been reached on the cessation of nuclear tests, and that consequently the atmosphere will no longer be poisoned. Our position and yours on this issue are very close together. All of this could possibly serve as a good impetus toward the finding of mutually acceptable agreements on other controversial issues on which you and I have been exchanging views. These issues have so far not been resolved, but they are awaiting urgent solution, which could clear up the whole international atmosphere. We are prepared for this. These are my proposals.
Dear Mr. Chairman, I have read your letter of October 26 with great care and welcome the statement of your desire to seek prompt solution to the problem. The first thing that needs to be done, however, is for work to cease on offensive missile bases in Cuba and for all weapon systems in Cuba capable of offensive use to be rendered inoperable under effective United Nations arrangements. Assuming this is done promptly, I have given my representatives in New York instructions that will permit them to work out this weekend, in cooperation with the Acting Secretary General and your representative, an arrangement for a permanent solution to the Cuban problem along the lines suggested in your letter of October 26th. As I read your letter, the key elements of your proposals, which seem generally acceptable as I understand them, are as follows. 1. You would agree to remove these weapon systems from Cuba under appropriate United Nations observation and supervision, and undertake, with suitable safeguards, to halt the further introduction of such weapon systems into Cuba. 2. We, on our part, would agree upon the establishment of adequate arrangements through the United Nations to ensure the carrying out and continuation of these commitments. A. To remove promptly the quarantine measures now in effect, and B. To give assurances against an invasion of Cuba. I am confident that other nations of the Western Hemisphere would be prepared to do likewise. If you will give your representative similar instructions, there is no reason why we should not be able to complete these arrangements and announce them to the world within a couple of days. The effect of such a settlement on easing world tensions would enable us to work toward a more general arrangement regarding other armaments, as proposed in your second letter, which you made public. I would like to say again that the United States is very much interested in reducing tensions and halting the arms race. And if your letter signifies that you are prepared to discuss a détente affecting NATO and the Warsaw Pact, we are quite prepared to consider with our allies any useful proposals. But the first ingredient, let me emphasize, is the cessation of work on missile sites in Cuba and measures to render such weapons inoperable under effective international guarantees. The continuation of this threat or a prolonging of this discussion concerning Cuba by linking these problems to the broader questions of European and world security would surely lead to an intensification of the Cuban crisis and a grave risk to the peace of the world. For this reason, I hope we can quickly agree along the lines in this letter and in your letter of October 26th.
Dear Mr. President, I have received your message of October 27th. I express my satisfaction and thank you for the sense of proportion you have displayed and for realization of the responsibility which now devolves on you for the preservation of the peace of the world. I regard with great understanding your concern and the concern of the United States people in connection with the fact that the weapons you describe as offensive are formidable weapons indeed. Both you and we understand what kind of weapons these are. In order to eliminate as rapidly as possible the conflict which endangers the cause of peace, to give an assurance to all people who crave peace, and to reassure the American people who, I am certain, also want peace, as do the people of the Soviet Union, the Soviet government, in addition to earlier instructions on the discontinuation of further work on weapons construction sites, has given a new order to dismantle the arms which you describe as offensive and to crate and return them to the Soviet Union. Mr. President, I should like to repeat what I had already written to you in my earlier messages, that the Soviet government has given economic assistance to the Republic of Cuba as well as arms, because Cuba and the Cuban people were constantly under the continuous threat of an invasion of Cuba. The Cuban people want to build their life in their own interests without external interference. This is their right, and they cannot be blamed for wanting to be masters of their own country and disposing of the fruits of their own labor. The threat of invasion of Cuba and all other schemes for creating tension over Cuba are designed to strike at the Cuban people with a sense of insecurity, intimidate them, and prevent them from peacefully building their new life. Mr. President, I should like to say clearly once more that we could not remain indifferent to this. The Soviet government decided to render assistance to Cuba with the means of defense against aggression, only with means for defensive purposes. We have supplied the defense means which you describe as offensive. We have supplied them to prevent an attack on Cuba, to prevent rash attacks. I regard with respect and trust the statement you made in your message of October 27, 1962, that there would be no attack, no invasion of Cuba, and not only on the part of the United States, but also on the part of other nations of the Western Hemisphere, as you said in your same message. Then the motives which induced us to render assistance of such kind to Cuba disappear. It is for this reason that we instructed our officers. These means, as I had already informed you earlier, are in the hands of Soviet officers to take appropriate measures to discontinue construction of the aforementioned facilities, to dismantle them, and to return them to the Soviet Union. As I had informed you in the letter of October 27th, we are prepared to reach agreement to enable United Nations representatives to verify the dismantling of these means. Thus, in view of the assurances that you have given and our instructions on dismantling, there is every condition for eliminating the present conflict. I note with satisfaction that you have responded to the desire I expressed with regard to the elimination of the aforementioned dangerous situation, as well as with regard to providing conditions for a more thoughtful appraisal of the internal situation, fraught as it is with great dangers in our age of thermonuclear weapons, rocketry, spaceships, global rockets, and other deadly weapons. All people are interested in ensuring peace. Therefore, vested with trust and great responsibility, we must not allow the situation to become aggravated and must stamp out the centers where a dangerous situation fraught with grave consequences to the cause of peace have arisen. If we, together with you and with the assistance of other people of goodwill, succeed in eliminating this tense atmosphere, we should also make certain that no other dangerous conflicts which could lead to a world nuclear catastrophe would arise. In conclusion, I should like to say something about a détente between NATO and the Warsaw Treaty countries that you have mentioned. We have spoken about this long since and are prepared to continue to exchange views on this question with you and to find a reasonable solution. We should like to continue the exchange of views on the prohibition of atomic and thermonuclear weapons, general disarmament, and other problems relating to the relaxation of international tension. Although I trust in your statement, Mr. President, there are irresponsible people who would like to invade Cuba now and thus touch off a war. If we do take practical steps and proclaim the dismantling and evacuation of the means in question from Cuba, in doing so, at the same time, want the Cuban people to be certain that we are with them and are not absolving ourselves of responsibility for rendering assistance to the Cuban people. We are confident that the people of all countries, like you, Mr. President, will understand me correctly. We are not threatening. We want nothing but peace. Our country is now on the upsurge. Our people are enjoying the fruits of their peaceful labor. They have achieved tremendous successes since the October Revolution and created the greatest material, spiritual, and cultural values. Our people are enjoying these values. They want to continue developing their achievements and ensure their further development on the way of peace and social progress by their persistent labor. I should like to express the following wish. It concerns the Cuban people. You do not have diplomatic relations, but through my officers in Cuba, I have reports that American planes are making flights over Cuba. We are interested that there should be no war in the world, and that the Cuban people should live in peace. And besides, Mr. President, it is no secret that we have our people in Cuba. Under such a treaty with the Cuban government, we have sent their officers, instructors, mostly plain people, specialists, agronomists, zoo technicians, irrigators, land reclamation specialists, plain workers, tractor drivers, and others. We are concerned about them. I should like you to consider, Mr. President, that violation of Cuban airspace by American planes could also lead to dangerous consequences. And if you do not want this to happen, it would be better if no cause is given for a dangerous situation to arise. We must be careful now and refrain from any steps which would not be useful to the defense of the states involved in this conflict, which could only cause irritation and even serve as a provocation for a fateful step. Therefore, we must display sanity, reason, and refrain from such steps. We value peace, perhaps even more than other peoples, because we went through a terrible war with Hitler. But our people will not falter in the face of any test. Our people trust in their government. And we assure our people and world public opinion that the Soviet government will not allow itself to be provoked. But if the provocateurs unleash a war, they will not evade responsibly. And they will not evade responsibility and the grave consequence a war would bring upon them. But we are confident that reason will triumph, that war will not be unleashed, and peace and the security of the peoples will be ensured.
Dear Mr. Chairman, I am replying at once to your broadcast message of October 28, even though the official text has not yet reached me because of the great importance I attach to moving forward promptly to the settlement of the Cuban crisis. I think that you and I, with our heavy responsibilities for the maintenance of peace, were aware that developments were approaching a point where events could have become unmanageable. So I welcome this message and consider it an important contribution to peace. The distinguished efforts of Acting Secretary General U Thant have greatly facilitated both our tasks. I consider my letter to you of October 27th and your reply of today as firm undertakings on the part of both our governments which should be promptly carried out. I hope that the necessary measures can at once be taken through the United Nations as your message says, so that the United States in turn can remove the quarantine measures now in effect. I have already made arrangements to report all these matters to the Organization of American States, whose members share a deep interest in a genuine peace in the Caribbean area. Mr. Chairman, both of our countries have great unfinished tasks, and I know that your people, as well as those of the United States, can ask for nothing better than to pursue them free from the fear of war. Modern science and technology have given us the possibility of making labor fruitful beyond anything that could have dreamed of a few decades ago. I agree with you that we must devote urgent attention to the problem of disarmament, and as it relates to the whole world and also to critical areas. Perhaps now, as we step back from danger, we can together make real progress in this vital field. I think we should give priority to questions relating to the proliferation of nuclear weapons on Earth and in outer space, and to the great effort for a nuclear test ban. But we should also work hard to see if wider measures of disarmament can be agreed and put into operation at an early date. The United States government will be prepared to discuss these questions urgently and in a constructive spirit at Geneva or elsewhere. John F. Kennedy.
I have chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth, peace. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age where great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age where a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. To secure these ends, high-level discussions will shortly begin in Moscow, looking towards early agreement on a comprehensive test ban treaty. To make clear our good faith and solemn convictions on this matter, I now declare that the United States does not propose to conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere so long as other states do not do so. The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
Thank you for saving the world.
Yes.
So we tried.
Good job.
Just, if you're interested in more information about the Cuban Missile Crisis, PBS will have a special on this week, starting tomorrow evening at 7:30, called 3-Minute War, specifically about Castro, Khrushchev, and Kennedy. Questions and comments?
My name's Herbert Deloney. I grew up in Charles. I was 14 at the time, just beginning high school, and I had younger brothers and sisters in junior high and elementary. And the school kids were all getting fingerprinted. They were arranging for parents to come to the schools to assist with evacuations, should that be necessary, because the school buses wouldn't be sufficient. And those parents who were volunteering were told the blankets and the amount of water to put in there for so many days. But anyway, the fingerprinting was because nobody knew who would survive and where you'd end up. We were told that you had about 30 or 40 minutes, the time for the missiles to get from Cuba to Lake Charles. Now, why were we a target? Two reasons. One, a number of oil refineries, and if you're thinking in military terms, fuel is a very important asset. Two, we had a SAC base, SAC, Strategic Air Command. In other words, B-52 bombers. When military talk about, I was in the reserves, when they use the word tactics, they're talking about the battlefield. A tactical weapon, like a cannon, it's on the battlefield there. Strategic, you're going to the next battlefield over. You're talking about the long-range plan of things. Strategic Air Command meant B-52 bombers and nuclear weapons. They never actually would say they had nuclear weapons, but that was part of the thing of building the B-52s. It's a jet plane that would put a 747 to shame because it has 8 engines. It can fly higher and faster than most anything that could chase it down. And the runway for a B-52 had to be so thick and so long that they could land a space shuttle on it. And we had both of those. So we were on the hit list twice. One time it happened as a child that one of the jets crash landed. I think the landing gear failed. We had to evacuate that side of town. No explanation given except that, well, they just mentioned on the news the problems over there are solved so you can return back home. And on 9/11, 11 years ago, the president was in Florida when it happened, and he got in his plane and they took off and they detoured to Louisiana to a Strategic Air Command base. What sort of defenses they have at those bases, I don't know. When the plane landed, it was immediately surrounded by a SWAT team of black-clad soldiers with automatic weapons, with weapons pointed outward. And even though they won't say it, I'm sure that they have nuclear weapons there. And they also have defenses that I'm sure we won't find out about for another 40 or 50 years. Oh, one other thing. Listening to them talk about it, even now, it churns my stomach, thinking back to that time.
Questions or comments?
I seem to remember reading at one time or another that Kennedy had an advantage in that he had some source within the Kremlin that that informed him Khrushchev would in fact back down. Do you know of anything like that?
That's the first I've heard of. I know he had somewhat cordial relations with Gromyko, and he met with Gromyko on October 18th. Kennedy found out about the missiles 2 days before, and so he's going into this meeting in the Oval Office with Gromyko, knowing that there's something going on in Cuba, but he can't let on. So I know that he had cordial relations with Gromyko, but I don't think Gromyko would be a source of any of that.
No, this was, I may be mistaken.
Comments or questions? Well, thank you very much for your attendance and your kind attention. Y'all have a pleasant evening.